Hi, welcome to this Young Wong's video about getting started with your Raspberry Pi. Here we're going to talk about the essentials and end up with a simple GPIO program to blink an LED. Now, first of all, let's get started. What we need is the Raspberry Pi, and here we have the Raspberry Pi 4 with the 8 GB variant. Now you could pretty much get any other variant of the Raspberry Pi 4 or even the Raspberry Pi 3B Plus, and the procedure to get started would remain the same. So brand new Raspberry Pi, and yeah, looks pretty cool. Always exciting to open a new one. With this, we recommend that we always use the official Raspberry Pi power adapter, because this provides the required amount of power for it to run properly. So that's the Raspberry Pi official adapter, and along with this you can definitely get the Raspberry Pi official case, which is really fun. Now along with this, these are the essentials, and for this we also need the SD card, and I would recommend a 32 GB SD card with this SD card adapter for us to be able to load the operating system onto it. These are definitely necessities. And in addition to this, what makes it easy to set up is if we have a keyboard, a mouse, and a monitor to which we can hook up our Raspberry Pi. Now, in order to connect our Raspberry Pi to the monitor, we're going to need this HDMI cable. And because this is the Raspberry Pi 4, we have a HDMI to a micro HDMI cable. Whereas if it were the Raspberry Pi 3B Plus, we would just use a regular HDMI cable itself. So you can buy all these components as a kit, or you can get them individually and get just these components, and either way would work. The first step for us is to load our OS onto the SD card so that then we can plug it into the Raspberry Pi. For this, we will use the Raspberry Pi Imager software that's available on the Raspberry Pi website itself, and it makes it very, very easy. So let's go on to the Raspberry Pi website and download the Raspberry Pi Imager software. And you have this available for Windows, Mac, and Ubuntu. We will use Windows, but the procedure will remain the same for any other platform. So once this is downloaded, you can go ahead and install it, and you can pretty much accept the defaults. And let's go ahead and run the imager. The cool thing about this imager is it also downloads the OS for you once you've chosen it. So we're going to choose the recommended basic one, and it'll also give us a choice of the SD card. You can use a 32-bit 32 GB one or a 64 GB one, and then just go ahead and say write. This is going to erase any data that is there on the SD card already. So now that we got the OS onto the SD card, we're going to now insert it into the Raspberry Pi. And there's an SD card slot at the bottom, and you're going to put in the SD card with the golden connectors facing towards the board. Okay, you see the color and the brands on the other side. So the SD card is facing towards the board. The next thing to do is to connect our HDMI cable to Raspberry Pi. We also connect the mouse and the keyboard. That should be enough to get our Raspberry Pi up and running, but we're going to be making some connections as well. So we're going to connect this GPIO extension, which is also called the Raspberry Pi cobbler. And this pretty much goes right on to the 40 pins of the Raspberry Pi. And the pink line, if you notice, should be facing the pin number 1, which is right at this end. The other end of this goes on to the breadboard, and you can notice the breadboard has some numbers So you might want to start at the 0 on one of these ends and align it to that, and then just sort of press it in, and that allows us to make our connections right here, and the pins are all available to us right on the breadboard. Now finally, we are going to power on the Raspberry Pi using the Raspberry Pi official charger, and voila, we can see on the monitor the Raspberry Pi boot up, and it should land you to a home screen. Now the first thing to do is connect to our Wi-Fi. This Wi-Fi allows us to remotely connect into our Raspberry Pi without a monitor. The second thing to do is to edit the Raspberry Pi configuration to allow remote connections through what is called VNC. And this is on the Interfaces tab in Raspberry Pi configuration. So we enable SSH and VNC. So now, once we've done this, we can go over to our computer and download the VNC viewer from the VNC viewer website. This is again available for multiple platforms. I like to use the standalone 64-bit one, which doesn't really require an installation, but you can choose any one of these. So once we've downloaded VNC viewer and launched it, we need to connect to the Raspberry Pi by using its IP address. Now we can detect this IP address using a Fing mobile app, or also when we had the Raspberry Pi connected to the monitor. Now we put in the default credentials, which are Pi and Raspberry, and hit OK. And this will allow us to connect to our Raspberry Pi right from our laptop. And now we don't need the monitor or the keyboard or the mouse anymore. The next thing to do is to build the circuit to blink an LED. And here we use an LED and a resistor, and we connect that to the ground pin, and we connect the positive of the LED to a GPIO pin. Now to get down to the coding. So as usual, we will first begin by importing the GPIO library, which is done by saying import rpi.gpio. We also import the time library for us to be able to add some delays. We set the pin mode to BCM, which allows us to refer to it just by using the GPIO numbers. And we set pin 26 as an output. Now, in a while true loop, we will turn on the LED, wait for a second, turn off the LED, and then wait for a second again. And then at the end, we always add a GPIO cleanup so that it doesn't remember any of the values that were set and forgets them. Something that I forgot to add at the beginning is the as GPIO at the top of the program. And voila, we can see the LED blink. Do try this out at home and let us know how your circuits turn out. Thank you.